Following on from a recent interview comment, I just wanted to talk in a little more depth about what seems to have happened to Retro Studios over the last 10 or so years. We know that the studio has experienced quite a bit of turmoil, but Nintendo has indicated that they had to be flat out rebuilt in order to create Metroid Prime 4. So, what is the truth of Retro Studios' tumultuous recent history, and why did it get in such a bad way? Let's investigate. Winding back to 2010, Retro Studios was actually riding high. They had completed three consecutive and widely celebrated Metroid Prime titles and then pivoted over to the triumphant return of Donkey Kong Country for the Wii's fifth holiday season, while they were also hard at work supporting the development of Mario Kart 7. And yet their 2013 sequel to Donkey Kong Country Returns slipped into February 2014, and even that title appeared to have heavy assistance from Monster Games Inc. What followed was a long and eerie silence from Retro. We know that they had a game called Harmony, an original title with a music, theme, and action gameplay that was leaked online, but which was seemingly cancelled before launch. We know that they completed the Switch port of Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze in 2018, and that around this time they started a remaster of Metroid Prime. And yet, they were overlooked for the key job of restarting the Metroid Prime series in 2017, despite their name being almost synonymous with the Metroid Prime games. Well, the recent Famitsu interview with Nintendo's developers, almost certainly series chief Kensuke Tanabe, appears to provide more context. It was stated in this interview: "The project changed development companies midway and we had to restart at Retro Studios. However, Retro Studios didn't have the infrastructure in place to develop a Metroid Prime title at that time, so we had to start by building that foundation." What does it say about Retro that by 2019 they didn't have the development capacity to create a game series that they were once known for? Clearly, game development costs and scope have increased prodigiously in that time period, so even the Retro of 2002 might have struggled to extend themselves to something of the scale of Metroid Prime 4, but I suspect there's something else going on. During the mid-2010s, Nintendo was in a tricky period. The Wii had fallen off hard in its final years, the Wii U was basically dead on arrival, the 3DS didn't have the most auspicious of starts, and the company found itself at the mercy of other issues besides. The move to HD was drastically increasing game development costs, while the strong yen was punishing Nintendo's businesses dramatically because it eroded the value of the foreign sales that generally made up the bulk of their gaming profits. Satoru Iwata guaranteed jobs and cut his own salary, and Nintendo could afford to do this because of their deep reserves, but during this time Nintendo posted losses, and it's fair to say that their backs were against the wall. Now, consider if you're Nintendo at this point and you have Retro Studios. The natural attrition rate for Western studios is generally higher than Japanese ones. Iwata said he wouldn't fire developers, but he didn't say anything about hiring new people. It feels plausible to me that there was a spending freeze or at least a significant restriction in hiring during this period against the backdrop of a natural leaching of talent to other American developers, especially at a time when Nintendo was losing some of the prestige it once had due to the lack of a strong home system offering, and during a period where Nintendo had now pivoted away from trying to be a leader in terms of technical innovation since 2006 when the Wii launched. This would explain why Monster Games were hired towards the end of Tropical Freeze. It might also explain Retro's fallow period. Harmony was obviously piloted as a fairly significant project, but what seemed like an achievable project in 2014 might have seemed like an expensive venture in 2016. It's not uncommon for games to be scrapped for reasons that they simply didn't work, but Nintendo may also have felt that the juice at this point was simply not worth the squeeze. Transitioning Retro to smaller, more manageable projects that would use a smaller portion of the studio's resources could have made some sense. I guess the logic here would have been that they could always hire in extra support groups to bolster Retro if they had a strong project on the books, but generally speaking, they didn't want Retro getting anything major up on their feet because this would incur costs that they really didn't want to have to meet at that particular point in time. When Harmony needed more work, they possibly judged that the support Retro would have needed would have been too great to continue. Porting Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze might in this light not purely have been a quick way to get a title for the Switch's early life, but might also have been a way for Retro to get their internal processes up to speed with the new technology of the Switch. Metroid Prime 4 was announced in June 2017. This was early in the Switch's life, and although it had a promising start, throttled mainly by supply issues, it was a long way from being the global juggernaut that we know the console has become today. At that point, hiring Bandai Namco Singapore probably made a lot of financial sense. While Singapore itself would have been relatively extensive, the studio often worked hand in glove with the Malaysian studio as well, and others in the Bandai Namco team. Bandai Namco therefore had the in-depth capabilities to do all the kinds of things required for a game like this, including movie production. Presumably some Retro staff would have advised on the title, but overall it would have saved significantly if Nintendo could successfully export the development to Singapore. Obviously, by the end of 2018, though, things were different. Switch had survived one of its weaker game lineups and made it to a strong holiday season with the Switch Lite and a very robust game slate just around the corner. Nintendo could afford to consider building the studio back up, and indeed, they were already doing so with Metroid Prime Remastered, even though that game was heavily supported by other studios as well. Even then, Nintendo has been incredibly careful about who it hires. I'm sure they aren't short on applicants, but Retro have hardly just gone on a supermarket sweep of the US developer community, but have expanded a lot on contract workers and still made heavy use of support studios even over the nigh on 7-year period between the reboot announcement for Metroid Prime 4 and the game's eventual release. I suspect in this way they've mitigated costs as far as possible, but it's also hard to avoid the conclusion that Nintendo now have an American studio that is capable of taking on significant projects and potentially in a shorter window of time than the seemingly rather beleaguered Prime 4 took. Nintendo can certainly afford to maintain such a studio, and it seems that the group have utility beyond simply their development capacity. Note the close relationship Nintendo have built with port specialist Panic Button, who even handled Nintendo Switch 2 upgrades for titles as prestigious as Super Mario Odyssey, and of course are also based in Austin, Texas in America. Austin's a fairly big city, but I suspect the game development community there isn't so inestimably massive that Nintendo having an Austin branch wasn't of use to them in terms of building those connections. Even if Retro don't hire the key associates from Metroid Prime 4 to become internal developers, they now have a web of contacts in a range of fields which will probably come to be quite useful, and so I'm actually optimistic about how they might be deployed going forward. For more specific investigations into what Retro Studios might do next, do check out some of my other videos coming onto the screen in a second, and please consider checking out the Patreon, where there is plenty of early, exclusive, and ad-free content. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.